The storm came suddenly, sweeping across the plains like a wild beast tearing through the night. The wind howled against the wooden walls of the small cabin, and rain lashed the windows so hard that the glass rattled in its frame. Inside, a single candle flickered, casting a trembling glow over the woman sitting by the fire. Her name was Clara Henderson. She wasn't young anymore, not in the way that caught a man's eye. Her dress clung to her heavy frame, damp from the rain she'd walked through earlier that day. Her hair, chestnut and tangled, framed a round face that had known both laughter and heartbreak. She wasn't beautiful by the town standards, and she knew it. That was something people never let her forget. But she could cook. Lord, could she cook? And that was the only reason she stood on the porch of a stranger's ranch that morning, clutching a small basket of bread and courage. The land stretched wide and open, dotted with cattle and shadowed by the long wooden fence that separated the world of the wealthy ranchers from the desperate settlers. Clara's family had been among the first to settle the edge of Iron Ridge, but when her father died of fever, and her mother soon after, she was left with little more than debts and a crumbling cabin. The only work left for her was to cook or clean, and even then, the women whispered and the men laughed. "No one loves a fat girl, Clara," her reflection seemed to say every morning. "But I can cook," she whispered back, as if that were enough to fill the hollow in her chest. The man she went to see that day was Jacob Rowan, the richest rancher in Iron Ridge. He'd lost his wife 3 years ago in childbirth, and though the town called him cold, some whispered he was just broken. He ran his ranch with iron discipline, spoke little, and hired no one he didn't trust. When Clara reached his front porch, rain-soaked and breathless, she hesitated before knocking. The wind tugged at her shawl, and her heart thumped so loudly she almost turned away. But hunger, and something deeper than hunger, kept her there. The door opened. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, and serious-eyed. His flannel shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing forearms hardened by work, and his expression was the kind that made most people take a step back before they spoke. "What do you want?" he asked, voice even but low. Clara gripped the basket tighter. "Sir, I came to ask if you might need a cook." He glanced at her, then at the basket. "I've got one." "She quit 2 days ago," Clara replied quietly, eyes lowering. "I saw her leaving town. Said she couldn't stand the work no more." Jacob studied her for a moment longer. The storm wind whistled through the porch boards. He didn't answer right away, and when he finally spoke, his tone was sharp but not cruel. "You're a settler," he said. "You live by the ridge." "Yes, sir. My cabin's near the stream. I can cook, clean, and bake. I can start right now if you let me." His brow furrowed slightly, as though something about her persistence both impressed and annoyed him. "You're alone." "I am," she said, her voice trembling. "My folks passed last winter." He looked at her again, really looked this time. Her eyes were soft brown, her hands calloused, her dress plain but neat. There was humility in her, but also a flicker of stubborn fire that he couldn't quite ignore. Finally, he nodded toward the door. "You can start by making supper." Clara blinked, almost disbelieving. "You mean?" He stepped aside. "If you're half as good as you say, we'll talk about wages after I've eaten." The warmth of his house hit her like sunlight after rain. Inside, everything smelled of leather and pinewood. The kitchen was clean but cold, with an untouched hearth and a stack of unwashed dishes. Clara rolled up her sleeves, tied her shawl around her waist, and got to work. She moved quietly but with confidence. Her hands knew what to do: salt the stew, knead the dough, chop the onions just so. The aroma soon filled the air, drifting down the hallway. When Jacob passed by the doorway, he paused. For the first time in a long while, something about that smell reminded him of home, back before loss had made his world so small. When supper was ready, Clara set the table, her heart pounding. She didn't dare sit with him. Instead, she stood back as he took his seat. Jacob spooned a bit of the stew, then looked up at her. "Sit," he said simply. Her breath caught. "Sir, I." "Sit," he repeated, softer this time. She obeyed, hands folded tightly in her lap. For a few long moments, the only sound was the clink of his spoon and the crackle of the fire. Finally, he looked up again. "You weren't lying." "About what, sir?" "Your cooking." He took another bite. "It's good. Best I've had in a long time." A small, shy smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad." He nodded. "You can stay on, if you want. Room's out back, next to the barn. Pays $12 a month." Her eyes widened. "That's more than fair, sir." He shrugged. Then it settled. As the rain eased outside, Clara helped clean the dishes and set things right before retiring to the small room behind the barn. It wasn't much, just a cot, a small table, and a quilt, but to her, it felt like a palace. For the first time in months, she whispered a prayer of gratitude before sleep. Maybe, just maybe, life was turning. The following weeks were steady and quiet. Clara rose before dawn, made biscuits and coffee, then cooked for the ranch hands who rode out before sunrise. Jacob was always the last to come in, the first to leave, speaking little but always noticing everything. Once, when she cut her hand on a kitchen knife, he appeared at her side within seconds, wrapping the wound himself. "Be careful," he said gruffly, eyes avoiding hers. "You don't need to bleed over everything you cook." She smiled faintly through the sting. "You'd be surprised how many meals I've bled for, sir." Something about that made him pause, perhaps the quiet honesty in her words. He wanted to ask more, but didn't. By the end of that month, even the ranch hands had grown fond of her. She packed their lunches, patched their shirts, and always greeted them with a kind word. But still, Clara noticed the stares when she passed through town. The whispers. "That's the new cook from Rowan's place," one woman muttered behind her hand. "Big as a barrel, that one. Must have begged him for the job." Clara kept walking, head held low. She'd learned long ago that some people only saw the outside. One afternoon, she brought Jacob lunch out in the pasture. He was mending a fence, his hat shading his eyes from the sun. She placed the basket beside him and waited quietly as he finished hammering a nail. "You didn't have to come all the way out here," he said without looking up. "I wanted to," she replied softly. "Figured you'd skip lunch otherwise." He smiled a little, the kind of small, fleeting smile that looked strange on a man so serious. "You might be right." They sat side by side, sharing sandwiches and lemonade. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it felt almost peaceful. Finally, Clara said, "I know people talk, sir. About me. About what I look like." She stared down at her hands. "It doesn't bother me much anymore. Just. I wanted you to know I'm grateful you don't treat me the way they do." Jacob's jaw tightened slightly. "People around here have too much time to talk. I suppose." She gave a small, sad smile. "No one loves a fat girl, sir. But I can cook." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded. Jacob set down his sandwich, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. He wanted to say something, something that might soften the hurt she carried like a scar, but the words didn't come. "Not yet." Instead, he said quietly, "You shouldn't say that about yourself." Her lips parted slightly. "It's true, though." He looked away toward the hills. "Maybe it's true that most folks are blind. But not everyone." There was something in his tone, something that made her heart skip. But before she could speak again, he stood, brushing the dust from his jeans. "We better head back before the sun drops." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept replaying his words, his look, the softness that crept into his voice. For years, she had believed no man could look at her and see more than her size. But for a fleeting moment out on that field, she'd seen something in Jacob's eyes, a flicker of warmth, of understanding. And it scared her as much as it moved her. Because people like her didn't get happy endings. Not in this world. Still, hope, small, trembling, foolish hope, began to grow in her chest. But hope, she would soon learn, can be as dangerous as any storm. The days rolled into weeks, and spring warmed the air across Iron Ridge. The hills turned green again, and the sound of cattle echoed in the distance. Clara had found a rhythm in her days, quiet, simple, and steady. She cooked, cleaned, and kept to herself, but every morning, when Jacob walked into the kitchen for coffee, her heart beat a little faster. He wasn't a man of many words, but she had learned to read his silences. The way he'd linger a moment longer by the stove when she was baking. The rare smile when she handed him his mug. And once, when she'd burned her hand pulling bread from the oven, he'd caught her wrist so quickly she barely had time to flinch. "You've got to be careful," he'd said softly, his thumb brushing her skin before he pulled away. It was small things like that that kept her awake at night, wondering if maybe he felt what she did. But then came the day the strangers arrived. It was a bright Saturday afternoon when a wagon pulled up the long road to the ranch. 2 men and a woman stepped down, Jacob's sister, Ruth, and her husband and son from the city. They came dressed finer than anyone Clara had seen in months, their clothes spotless, their boots polished. Jacob greeted them warmly, though he looked uneasy, as if their visit meant more trouble than joy. Ruth was sharp-featured and proud, her eyes scanning everything with quiet judgment. "And who might you be?" she asked when Clara brought them lemonade. "I'm the cook, ma'am," Clara said softly. "Clara Henderson." Ruth's lips twitched into a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I see. Well, Jacob's always had a generous heart. I suppose he needed someone to keep the place in order." Clara nodded, her cheeks warm. She could feel the woman's gaze flick up and down, assessing her weight, her clothes, her face. That evening, Clara prepared a full supper, roast chicken, potatoes, gravy, and pie. The guests praised the meal, though Ruth's compliments were more to her brother than to Clara herself. When the plates were cleared, Ruth turned to Jacob. "It's good you hired help, though I can't imagine you'd find much company way out here." Jacob looked puzzled. "Company?" Ruth smiled faintly. "You know what I mean. You're still young, Jacob. You should think about remarrying someday. Maybe someone from town, someone proper." Clara froze by the doorway, her hands gripping the tray. Jacob's voice was calm. "I've got all I need here." Ruth laughed lightly. "Oh, brother, you can't mean that. You need a woman beside you, someone to match your name, not a cook in an apron." Clara turned before they saw her face. She went to the kitchen and stood by the sink, staring out the small window as her heart sank. That night, she cried quietly into her pillow. She wasn't angry at Ruth. She wasn't even angry at Jacob. She was angry at herself, for hoping. For thinking maybe she could belong in his world. The next morning, Jacob found her outside, kneading dough on the porch table. Her eyes were red, and she wouldn't look at him. "You didn't eat breakfast," he said gently. "I wasn't hungry, sir." He hesitated. "Did something happen last night?" She shook her head. "No, sir. Everything's fine." But her voice cracked, betraying her. Jacob stepped closer, lowering his tone. "Clara, talk to me." She set the dough aside and wiped her hands on her apron. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "Your sister's right. You need someone proper. I'm just the cook." "I know that." His brows drew together. "That's not what I'll finish the season," she interrupted, still avoiding his gaze. Then I'll go. You deserve better than to have folks whispering about you keeping a woman like me around. He took a deep breath, frustration tightening his jaw. A woman like you? Clara's voice trembled as she spoke the words she'd held inside for years. No one loves a fat girl, sir. But I can cook. That's all I have to offer. For a moment, the world went silent around them, the wind, the cattle, even the creak of the porch. Then Jacob stepped forward, his eyes dark and fierce. Don't you ever say that again. She finally looked at him, startled. He took her flour-dusted hand in his. You think I keep you here because you can cook? Because I pity you? I don't. He shook his head, his voice soft but steady. I keep you here because you're the only person who makes this place feel like home again. You're the only one who laughs when the men are tired, who sings when you think no one's listening, who makes the house smell like life again. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't mean that. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. I've meant every word I've ever said to you. Clara's breath hitched, and for a long, quiet moment, they simply stood there, the world holding still around them. But before she could speak, Ruth's voice called from inside the house. Jacob. We're ready to head into town. He pulled back slightly, his expression softening. We'll talk later, he said, almost reluctantly. Then he turned and walked toward the house, leaving her standing there, heart pounding. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara sat on the porch steps, thinking. The air smelled of grass and rain, and the sky glowed orange and pink. Jacob returned just before dark. He carried a small brown parcel and handed it to her. What's this? She asked. Open it. Inside was a white apron, new and crisp, with her initials stitched on the corner in blue thread. Her throat tightened. It's beautiful. He smiled faintly. It's yours. Thought it was about time you had something that belonged only to you. She swallowed hard, her eyes filling again. Thank you, sir. Jacob, he said quietly. When it's just us, call me Jacob. She nodded, unable to speak. He tipped his hat and started for the barn. Then, just before he disappeared into the shadows, he turned back. And Clara, he said softly, don't ever think no one loves you. She froze, her heart thundering in her chest as he walked away. For a long while, she sat there under the fading sky, clutching the apron against her chest, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was something. And for Clara, that something felt like hope. She looked up at the stars and whispered to herself, maybe love doesn't need to look the way people think it should. The wind carried her words into the night, and somewhere deep inside, she believed them. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just the fat girl who could cook. She was Clara Henderson, strong, kind, and finally, just maybe, loved.